Thank you, folks, for voting in that poll, letting us know how many individuals are watching from your household. Always helpful for us to know how many faces are behind those screens, so we appreciate it when you take an opportunity to fill that out for us. Absolutely, thank you. All right, folks, we've hit 7 p.m., so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Annie Tillman. I'm the Adult Program Coordinator at the Schaumburg Library. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I see that we've got a couple of friends from further out in the United States beyond Schaumburg, so thank you for joining us today. Tonight we have Kim Sifagus. Did I pronounce that right?
You're close. It's Sifagus.
Sifagus, Kim Sifagus. Thank you for correcting me.
Yeah.
Tonight we're going to be talking about oral history and traditions of American Indians. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat box or use the Q&A. We'll get to those at the end of the program. I'll pop back on and ask those aloud. If you're interested in our other programs, coming up, we have holiday gift wrapping to learn how to wrap some of those harder to wrap items on Saturday. So you can look for that on Zoom. You can register on our website or you can watch it on YouTube. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Kim.
Thank you. Hello, or Buzu, as we say in Ojibwa land, I guess. My name is Kim Sifagus, like she said. I am an Ojibwa woman, and my family is from White Earth Reservation, which is up in Minnesota. I am a native Minnesotan, and so to me, the reservation is up north because everything's up north there. And it's in that reservation is located in the northwest corner of Minnesota. I don't know if anyone's ever been up in that area. It's about an hour east of Fargo, and it's very flat there. Whereas now I live in Freeport, Illinois, and it's hilly here. And so it's a little bit different terrain, but of course, every direction, 20 minutes of any place you are is a lake. So they have that going for them anyway. My native name is Becca DeZequa. That means quiet woman. I was named by my uncle because my father passed away when I was a year old. So my uncle was the one that had chose my name for me. I must have been quieter back then than I am now, but it still resonates with me. It also means quiet soul, and so I think that probably describes me. I am a Native author, and I write Native American fiction and nonfiction. I write a fiction series called The Midday, which that word means mystically powerful in Ojibwa, and it's about an Ojibwa woman who owns a carnival that is, all the people in it are mystically powerful, and the carnival time travels. So every book is set in a different time and place, and it's a series, and there will be 8. And I just today finished book 6, so I'm heading toward the end there for this series. I also write nonfiction and children's young adult and children's books, and so they all have a Native theme, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it. I write books for children on bullying. I was bullied as a child, and so I went back into my memory and just parlayed some of my experiences into a fiction book. And so if you're interested in any of those, please feel free to check out my website, which is Kimberly Sigafus, SIGAFUS.com, pretty easy. And if you're interested in a book, just send me a message through my contact page and I'll be glad to send you one. I'll even sign it for you if you want. Otherwise, you can find them on Amazon as well. And I do have them on ebooked as well on there if you're a Kindle user. Well, like I said, I am Ojibwa, and I live in Freeport, Illinois right now. I moved here in 2012, but when I moved here, I was surprised that there weren't a whole lot of Native stuff going on in this area. There were a lot of Natives, excuse me, that lived in the state of Illinois, but I'm used to Minnesota where we have powwows going on all the time. There's a lot of, there's several reservations up there and in Wisconsin as well. And so I'm just used to, in the summertime going, and in the fall too, going out and going to the powwows and just eating all the great food and seeing all the great native things that people have made and things like that. And so I was surprised when I moved to Freeport, Illinois, that they didn't have a lot of native stuff. They do have powwows. There's a couple here and there. Of course, with COVID, I'm not sure they had any this year. If they did, I didn't hear about them, as I'd have been there maybe, but possibly. But so my thought when I moved to this state was that I would like to bring some of the native culture to people who might be interested in that native culture. And so I started researching a little bit more about the Native Americans that lived in Illinois. The Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, the Midwest Indians were called woodland Indians. And there were actually Ojibwa that lived in Freeport as well as in the state. They were mostly women, to be honest. The voyagers would come down the river and we would stop at the Ojibwa villages along the way, and maybe in Wisconsin or maybe Minnesota. And they would marry the Ojibwa women, and then they would take them with them. And some of them ended up settling in Illinois. And so there were some Ojibwa in Illinois. Now that's, of course, not the biggest nation that was here. There were many, many nations that were here in the early 1800s before they were moved out. The Illini, of course, was here, and most people know that since we're called Illinois, and that's where we got it from. The Iroquois were here. The Dakota Sioux were here. The Ottawa, the Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Indians were here. The Kaskaskia Indians were here. The Miami, the Shawnee, the Sauk, and of course the Fox Indians were here as well. And so there was a lot of tribes or nations in this area of this long state of Illinois. And so they all lived here. So it was quite a huge native presence back in the early 1800s. Well, between the 1830 Indian Removal Act and 1850, about 1830 to 1850, the US government used forced treaties and the US Army action to move out about 100,000 American Indians that were living east of the Mississippi River, and they moved them westward to Indian Territory, which is now basically Oklahoma area. The Kaskaskia Indians and the Peoria Indians from Illinois were the last two tribes to move out of Illinois. And by 1832, every Indian was gone in this area that was accounted for anyway. And they basically stayed out. Now they tried to move the Ojibwa as well. The Ojibwa were primarily in Minnesota and Wisconsin and the top of Michigan. And they did try to move them out, but they came back. And when they came back, they put them on the larger reservations. And so we have large reservations in Minnesota as well as Wisconsin. But the natives that were in Illinois actually went to the bottom of the state and walked what's called the Northern Trail of the Trail of Tears. And most people have heard of the Trail of Tears. And but they took the Northern Trail that ran right across the bottom actually of Illinois. It crossed right over into Illinois. And so, excuse me, they took that very long walk, and many did not get to Oklahoma. And once they got there, of course, they weren't getting what they were promised. And so it was a bad time for our country, I think. But the government saw the opportunity to be able to get this land that we live on now. And they wanted it because for many reasons, but of course, farming was huge. And then we have really great soil in Illinois. And so big farms came to be. And so there was a lot of land being purchased. And in order to get people to buy the land, they had to move the Native Americans off because nobody wants to live the Native American who might attack your farm or your family. And so we were looked on as kind of savages and people that were basically second-class citizens and not actually people, I guess, if you understand what I'm saying. But in 1953, the American Indian Center opened, the AIC, in Chicago. 65,000 Native Americans are now living in the Chicagoland area mostly because of that AIC, that center. That center, when it came to be in 1953, it was determined, the people were determined to invite the Native Americans back to the Chicagoland area as well as Illinois. They wanted to be a support for these people. They wanted them to come in and share their culture, and they wanted to keep the culture alive. And it was very, very important that the Native Americans felt comfortable coming back into the state. And if you know anything about our history around that time, you almost didn't want to admit that you were Native American. It was very hard to get a job. And so it was very hard. You were persecuted a little bit. And so to have the AIC open and be invited back was a really big deal. And so they now represent 140 nations through the AIC. And that's a really big deal, because now, before COVID and hopefully after COVID's over, they do hold a lot of powwows, and they have dinners, and they take care of their elderly. There was some land donated in the city of Chicago, and now they have a wonderful garden where they do Three Sisters planting and things like that people are able to see. And so people are more willing in the Native culture at this point to begin to share what they know with other people. Because of what's happened in the past, most Native American people up to that point had been very quiet about their culture. And so it was when they moved in 1953, when the AIC moved in, I think that gave people some hope that some of the culture and the language and things like that were going to be saved, and that it was going to be okay to share things with other people that were not Native. So I thought what I would do is talk a little bit about what it was like to be a Native American in the early 1800s, before they were moved out. Before I do that, I do usually get a question about Native American versus American Indian. They're the same thing, obviously. Just like the Chippewa is the same as the Ojibwa, okay? But the thing with the Native American, and the reason why a lot of natives are turning now to be wanting to be called American Indians, is because if you were born in America, then that makes you Native. So even if you're not of the American Indian lineage, you would still be a Native American because you were born here. And so if you ever hear about people wanting to be called one thing rather than the other, that I think it's personal preference, but that's where that came from. Well, life in the 1800s, in the early 1800s, was it was very, very different, of course, than the way it is now. We lived in villages in the spring and in the summer that had over 100 people in it, and it was a lot of people to feed, and a lot of people to keep healthy, and a lot of people to keep safe. And so life in the village was pretty much communal. There was nobody that went hungry. When there was when the hunting parties went out, they hunted for everybody. So everyone got a chance to eat, and everyone got what they needed. They lived off the land, of course. We were called woodland Indians. And of course, the people and the natives that lived in Arizona would have been living off the land as well as all over the country. But the way they lived here was they did hunting and fishing, and they were avid gardeners. And so they couldn't go to the Walmart. There was no Cub food. And so everything that they needed, they could get from hunting or from growing it. And so they lived off the land. They did a lot of gardening. They were avid gardeners. One of the things they did was the Three Sisters planting. And it's a companion planting. And it's a different way to plant. So if you haven't heard of it before, what it is planting beans, corn, and squash together. And you make a hill. It's quite a large hill. It's like a little mound, big mound, or not a little mound, but a big mound. And then you plant the corn. And when the corn has grown about 2 feet, you plant your beans. Why do you plant your beans under the corn? Well, you probably figured out the fact that they love to climb, and the stalk was right there. So they climbed up the stalk. Well, you planted, after that was pretty much up and moving, you would plant your squash. The squash would cover the ground, hopefully get rid of the weeds and be ground cover down there. All of those 3 plants actually put things, nutrients into the soil that actually help each other grow. Sunflowers and lavender is also something else you can do in Three Sisters planting. There's wonderful books out there on companion planting, and there's many things you can plant together. But those were the main things that were planted in the companion planting, the Three Sisters planting for the Native Americans or the American Indians. And so if you would look across the field, if you, like now we're driving down the road and we see these beautiful cornfields and soybean fields and just beautiful fields, and all the rows are so nice and gorgeous. And back then you would have looked and seen just mound after mound after mound, and they were all spaced so many inches apart. And so it would have looked completely different. I know it's kind of hard to explain how this works. So I do have a picture. I'm going to try to make sure I can pull it up. So I am going to see here if I can get this up. This is a picture that I took the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwa in Minnesota. Have a wonderful museum right on the lake, and they have a wonderful Three Sisters garden. And so I took this picture so that I could show people what I was talking about when I did these presentations. So let's see. Okay, hopefully you can see this. Basically, you can look on the bottom, you see the squash growing down there, and there's the flowers down there. And if you look really close, you can also see the corn and then the beans growing up the stalk. So that's actually how it looks. And so it takes a while, of course, to get that high. But of course, you plant in the spring and then you harvest in the fall. So let me stop sharing that. Okay. So you'll have to excuse me. I don't know what's happening with my throat today. It's not even sore. I don't know what the deal is. I've been talking too much. Maybe that my husband would tell you that. Anyway, the other thing, excuse me, the other thing that they grew, especially in Minnesota, not so much here, but in Minnesota, was the wild rice. And the manuman, which is the name, the Ojibwa name for it, is actually means food that grows on water. And they used to take the canoes out, and they would have a poler, which is a guy standing there with a pole, and he would be standing in your canoe, and he would be moving your canoe very slowly through the water. And then they would have someone seated in the middle of the canoe, and they would have a stick, and they would bend down the stalks of the wild rice, and they would hit the stalks, and the rice would fall right into the boat. And so then when their boat was full, they would go into shore. Traditionally, they dug quite a wide hole, and they had boys about 13 or 14 years old. They took off their moccasins and stomped around on the rice. And that, of course, was to dehusk the rice. And so then they had birch bark baskets made from birch bark trees. And they wove those pretty tight, but there were still little holes around. And so you could throw up the rice like this, and the husks would fly out, hopefully. And that was just the beginning of how they processed the rice. And you can get rice still in White Earth. You can actually go on the I think it's whiteearth.org website, and you can actually order the rice right from that reservation. There are other places in the US as well that you can get wild rice. Now, wild rice, a little bit about wild rice. It has a really different earthy taste. So if you've never had it before, it's not minute rice. It's not the same as minute rice. It doesn't even look the same. But it does take a lot longer to cook. Excuse me. And so it takes about 20 minutes to cook that rice. Now, Uncle Ben's wild rice takes 5 minutes. And sometimes I cheat and use that because sometimes I don't have 20 minutes to cook that wild rice. But I have a wonderful recipe called wild rice and turkey soup. And it's a great thing to do with your holiday leftovers. So it's a cream soup and it has shiitake mushrooms in it. So if anyone is interested in that recipe, I will be glad to send it to you. If you just go on my website and send me a message through my contact page, I will just email you the recipe, or I can email it to the library and you can get it from there as well. It's really, really good, but you have to like shiitake mushrooms. It has wild rice in it, of course. It's really, really a really good way to use up turkey if you have any leftover turkey still. Okay. Excuse me, sorry. So courting in the village, there's a lot of people. I mean, 100 people, that's a lot. So there's, of course, going to be a young man who's looking to get married and maybe spies a young lady across the way. You weren't really allowed to go up and just basically ask her out. There was certain rituals that you had to go through. As a young man, that's where that flute music came in. The flute was generally played by men. It was traditionally played by men. It was a courting instrument. And so if you, as a young man, liked a young lady, you would wait until after it got dark, after what we would traditionally call the supper hour, and you would go and sit outside her fire and you would start to play your flute. And if she liked you, she would ask permission to go out and sit next to you and by the fire, and you would talk. Now, if you were out there playing your flute for a long time and she didn't come out, you probably should go home because everyone now is probably watching you and wondering what you're doing. But hopefully, hopefully she came out. You would sit and talk, and that would begin your relationship. Eventually, you might decide to marry. Marriage was quite different. We didn't have the $3,000 wedding dresses and the catering bill and all of that. We basically had what's known as sponsors, which is basically the best man and the maid of honor. But this couple was married, and that was important because that couple's responsibility was to help the couple through that first year of life. And sometimes that first year of life is kind of tough. And so they might need that help. One of the tough things is that the young man packs everything up after he gets married and he moves in with his wife's family. Now, it's not only just mom and dad. Sometimes there's brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and grandmas and grandpas. And so it could be quite a large wigwam or longhouse that they're living in. And so that's a lot of people on top of a lot of people. And so hopefully you guys would get along. And he was there for a year. After the year was up, the sponsors would come and ask the couple whether they still wanted to be married. How did things go? Hopefully they would have been touching base with them throughout the year. And so by this time, they probably would have had an idea of how things were going. But if things were going well, or maybe they had a child, they decided they wanted to stay together, they could move out after that year and they have their own wigwam and start their own family. If he didn't like her, or maybe she couldn't cook, or maybe she didn't know how to sew, or maybe she was complaining all the time, or maybe he did stuff that upset her, and they didn't want to stay together, then they just would split up. After a certain amount of time, they could go out and search again if that's what they wanted to do for another chance at love. And so it was quite different than the divorces that we put ourselves through nowadays anyway. Well, women had a lot of responsibility. Of course, men did as well. But being a woman, I'm a little biased. I have to say, I do think they worked really, really hard. They were responsible, of course, for maintaining the house. They were responsible for the cooking. They didn't have breakfast, lunch, and dinner like we have. There was no dinner bell, come and get it. It was not like that. They had a fire that was outside of the teepee. And then and they had stuff cooking on there all the time. So then she just stirred a little bit so it didn't burn, and if you were hungry, you just went over to the fire and you got some food. And that's just how it was. So there was no actual dinners. but she was also responsible, of course, for bearing children and taking care of children. Children were carried on their mom's back till they were about 2 years old, if you can imagine. They were in cradle boards, and if you haven't ever seen a cradle board, it's a wooden structure that you slide the baby into. And in the Ojibwa culture, there's an actual round hoop right here, and they hang things to play, the baby can play with as they get older, because they get kind of bored back there otherwise. One of the things that they hang back there is the dream catcher. And I know most of you know what a dream catcher is. Depending on which nation that you're actually looking into, the hole in the middle of the dream catcher can mean different things. For the Ojibwa, that hole means that when you are dreaming, all the good dreams go through the hole and pass on to you. The bad dreams get caught in the net or in the web, and then when the sunlight hits them, they disappear. Just a little etiquette with the dream catcher. A lot of times people will hang them on their wall. They have to have air flowing through them. If you have air only coming in one direction, everything gets caught in the web, the good and the bad dreams. So you should hang them so they could free flow above your bed. Also, try not to put them in your car. A lot of people have them hanging from their windshields, and they look really cool there. But again, they're for when you're sleeping, and hopefully you aren't asleep when you are driving your car. And so that's just another little piece of advice about dream catchers. You know, while the women were very, very busy, and by the way, they made their home completely. They actually put up the wigwams and things. They wove brushes, and they used those inside and out around the poles that were holding up the wigwam. When they moved, which they did, they were a little bit nomadic, and so they moved in the spring and they moved in the late fall. And when they did that, she had to take that house down and roll it up and carry it on her back. And so she was responsible completely for that household. Well, the men, of course, were busy too. They were basically the security for the camp. There was a lot of tribes around, especially in Illinois. There were many, many tribes. And so you didn't want to let your women or your children wander too far off from the camp, because the other tribes, they could be out hunting, they might see them, and they actually would take them, and that would be it. You wouldn't see them again. So that happened quite frequently, and so they were responsible for making sure everyone stayed within the perimeter of the camp. Of course, they were avid hunters. They had to hunt because that's how they ate. They did not kill anything that they did not use. It was never a sportsman type thing. So for example, if they were lucky enough to get a bear, and there were bear in this area as well as bison at one time, then they would, if they killed a bear, they would have it lay down to the point where they could put a pipe in its mouth. They would light the pipe full of tobacco and give thanks and say prayers for the bear for giving up his or her life so that the village could sustain their life. A lot of meat came out of a bear, and they were able to feed a lot of people. So it was a really important kill. They also used a lot of the bear grease. They made some food out of it. Some people put it in their hair. I can't imagine what that smelled like a couple days later, but to each its own. But they used every part of it. And of course, the fur was very, very important because we have winter here, and they needed to be warm. Now, they did move. In the spring, they moved to their spring summer camp. In the late fall, they would pack up and move to their winter camp. Now, the spring fall camp was pretty much right on the water, for obvious reasons. If you have a cabin or you've been out vacationing, you know how wonderful it is to be by the water in the summertime. But in the winter, they split up into smaller groups, and they moved inward a little bit. They needed a water source, so they were still kind of by water, but you had to walk to get there. And I always try to tell people, just to try to explain what it's like. For those of you who have ever been to Navy Pier, it might be really fun to camp out on Navy Pier in the summer. But if you try to put a tent out at the end of Navy Pier in the winter, yeah, that's not so fun. You could get blown right into the water. So, I mean, that's why they moved inward. When I first moved here from Minnesota, my husband took me to Navy Pier a couple of times, and one of them was in the winter. And I decided it was going to be fun to walk out to the end of Navy Pier because I thought, I'm a Minnesota girl, I can do this. Okay, somebody should have stopped me right there because, of course, I took about 4 steps and almost got blown into the water. So just a reminder that those winds are really whipping out there, and with lake effects, especially in the winter, you don't want to be camping too close to that. So, well, like I said earlier, they did a lot of fishing, of course, and so that was another way they supplemented their food. They also did maple syrup tapping. I don't know how many of you have done that before. I did it once. I got quite a large amount, and then I helped process it and ended up with not so much. So I realize now that how hard of work that it is and how much you have to have in order to just get a little jar of syrup. But they use that to, you know, to, as well as herbs and other things that they found in the woods. That their seasoning, that's how they made things sweet, or they, you know, they seasoned their food. Again, there was no Walmart, and they didn't have Lowry salt and garlic salt and all that stuff. So they had to use the stuff that they had. And so they were busy all the time. Now the men and the women both gardened. That was something that was done as a village, and children were out there too. Children learned at a young age all kinds of things. They learned how to sew. Men knew how to sew too, and they learned beadwork. They took the part of a ligament from a deer called the sinew, and they used that to actually sew their clothes. That's how they sewed their moccasins. That's how they sewed all their clothing. That was basically their thread. And so that they actually dried that out, and then they re-soaked it. And then you can pull it apart. It's quite long because obviously it comes from the leg, but you pull it off and it comes out in strands like thread. And so that's how it was used for them. Well, if you can imagine 100 people in a camp, and there's all kinds of children around, and it's time for bed. And so they have the same trouble we have, which is sometimes trying to get your kids to stay in bed and trying to get your kids to go to sleep. And so they of course had the same problems as we did. So, but one of the things they would do is they would tell them stories. And one of the things they told them was, if you don't go to sleep, the great horned owl is going to swoop down and pick you up and carry you off. I think that probably would have scared the dickens out of them, and probably some of them would have hid under their blanket and gone to sleep. But that doesn't work so well when you're trying to put a little baby to sleep or an infant to sleep. And so, of course, just like we do now, and all moms and grandmas and grandpas and dads, some dads maybe, is that they used to sing them to sleep. So what I thought I would do today is introduce you to my drum. I am a drummer and a singer. My son has several flutes, and he's a beautiful flute player, but I can't do anything but make very awful noises, my flute. So I very rarely play that at all. Excuse me. But I do drum. And so I am going to show you my drum. See if I might hide my own face trying to show this to you, but so this is one of my drums. It's red, obviously, so it's dyed. A lot of people will make designs, they paint designs on their drum. I don't ever do that because I love the leather, and I just love the texture of the drum, the way that it is. And so I have just always had drums that were just plain. I have several. I have one that's a lot bigger than this, and I have another one that's smaller than this. So it just depends on what I'm going to do. The back of the drum looks like this. I don't know if I can kind of show you. And basically, what you're seeing here, the thread is actually, again, the sinew. And that will actually crack eventually because it will dry out so much that it'll just crack and break. And then I will have to go in and have it restrung, kind of like a guitar needs to be restrung. This is a stone. The person who made this for me always puts a stone in the middle, and so they're all different. So everybody makes these a little bit differently, but the way it's basically made is the same. This is a tom. It's also called a beater. I prefer the word tom. You know, tom, you've probably heard of that. And it's basically wood with a leather, and then there's stuff that's inside of it. You can play your drum with your hand. And so when I am like singing my grandchildren to sleep, and I have 5 right now, I use my hand, but just in the interest of, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to hear me well enough, I'm going to go ahead and use my tom. The drum is actually considered a female instrument. It is round, and it represents in the Native culture Mother Earth. And so being as it's a female instrument, it's interesting to note that the larger drums that are used at powwow are generally not women drummed. Okay, so women are generally not allowed to drum those. Traditionally, those have always been drums that men did. Once in a while, you will see a woman at a powwow, but very rarely. But we are invited to use the hand drums. Excuse me. And so, like I said, it represents Mother Earth. And Mother Earth is the one that's responsible for all things that are living. And so it's very, very important. It's very important that our drums are to our community. I have a lot of drums that have been in my family for a long, long time. And so it's passed down. They can be passed down from one generation to the other. Okay, I'm going to back up a little bit here. Ugh. Okay, and I'm going to sing you. This is an Ojibwa lullaby, and so sorry for my voice today. My gosh. And so I'm going to sing it in the Ojibwa language, and I'm going to sing it in English after that. Hey, watane, hey, watane, hey, watane, keo kena, keo kena. Sleep, sleep, little one, sleep, sleep, little one, sleep, sleep, little one, now go to sleep, now go to sleep. Again, normally you would play with your hand and be tapping a little bit softer, because if I use the tom, that would definitely keep them awake. At some age, at not too far down the road from infancy, they start becoming more interested in the drum than in your song. And so at that point, you might have to try something else to get them to go to sleep. But anyway, this is a song that I sing for my grandchildren. And so they're used to that song, and they're old enough now. I have a 6-year-old grandchild who's old enough to sing that with me. So she likes that song. Okay. Children were taught orally any kind of traditions that needed to be passed down from member to member. And there were some stories that were not told to children because they weren't appropriate. And there are some stories that were not told to females because they weren't appropriate. So what I thought I would do is I thought I would tell you the Ojibwa story of creation. And interesting to note, it sounds a little bit like what you would read in the Bible, in the Christian Bible. It also is very similar to all the nations in the United States of America. We all have a very similar creation story. So I find that interesting, actually. So the story of creation starts off with the flood. And Gitche Manitou is the Great Spirit or God, and he did not like the way people were reacting. They were acting down here, and he saw all the lying and the cheating and the fighting and you know, it was just not good. And so what he thought he would do would be to wipe everything out and start over. And so he brought down a big flood and flooded everything, and there was nothing left except for the birds that were flying overhead and the animals and the fish that were swimming in the water. Well, when Nanabuzu was first man, they called him first man, and he was floating on a log, and he didn't know what to do because he'd been on that log for a really long time. And so he wanted to get off of that log and get out of the water. And he had been praying to Gitche Manitou, but Gitche Manitou was not in the mood to be listening. And so he was stuck on that log, and he was floating on there for a very long time. Well, he wasn't lonely. He had the fish that swam around him and the birds that would land periodically on the log. But basically, he was really fed up with being in the water that long. And so he started to think, and he thought, I wonder what I could do to maybe change Gitche Manitou's mind about maybe making some land so that I could get off this log, and maybe we could start over. So he sat there and he thought and he thought, and he's you know, I bet you there's some land, there's some dirt on the bottom of this water. If I dove down deep enough, I bet you I could go down there, grab some of that dirt, bring it up, and maybe I could talk Gitche Manitou into making land out of it. So he dived off that log and disappeared for a while. He came sputtering back up because he realized almost immediately that that water was too deep for him to be able to go down and get any of that land or any of that dirt. So he came back on the log and he looked around and he asked all of those little friends that were swimming around. And he said, will any of you volunteer to go down there? Because I really want that dirt from there. And so one by one, they volunteered. They were really anxious to help. And so they volunteered and they went down and down. Well, it didn't turn out well because it was a lot deeper than he thought. And every animal that he sent down there, he couldn't, he lost them all. They would come up, they gave up, or they would come up and they had passed away trying to help. It was just an awful mess. And he did not know what to do. He thought, that's my only chance, and I don't know how to get that. And I've lost a lot of friends, you know, and everyone who volunteered, it was just terrible. So he laid back on the log and he tried to think of something else. Well, pretty soon, the muskrat heard about what was going on, and the muskrat came over and pawed a little bit on the log and said, hey, I bet I can help. I'm really used to the water. Why don't you let me try to go down in there and get the dirt and bring it back up? And first man was like, no, look, I've lost a lot of friends. There is no way I'm sending you down there. Nanabuzu was like, nope, you're not going. You're too little. That's not going to work. And so Muskrat kept begging and begging and begging and begging. Finally, the first man said, all right, fine, go ahead and try. I don't think it's going to work. Please be careful, go ahead. Well, the muskrat dived down and disappeared in the water. Excuse me. And so he was gone a long time, and all the animals were looking and they couldn't see him. And first man was looking down and he couldn't see him. And he just knew the worst thing had happened. Well, sure enough, the muskrat's lifeless body floated up to the top of the water. And Nanabuzu picked him up and put him on the log. And when he did that, the body turned over a little bit, and in his paw, in the muskrat's paw, was some dirt. See, what had happened was somehow he had gotten all the way to the bottom, but he couldn't make it back before he ran out of air. So Nanabuzu took the dirt from the paw. He stood up on the log and he blew in all four directions. And he turned all the way around, And then he said prayer after prayer to Gitche Manitou, that somehow he would be able to bring land up from the bottom of the water. And that's what happened. Gitche Manitou saw what Muskrat had done and that he had given his life for his friends. And so he brought the land up from the water. And Nanabazoo was able to move his log over to it and get off. And when he got off, he was able to make all the trees and the flowers and all the things that all the animals needed to survive and to live. And he made everything beautiful again. But he didn't forget about Muskrat. He went back over to Muskrat and he picked him up and he held him in front of all his friends. And he said, I want you to remember Muskrat, because he did a wonderful thing. He gave his life so that we could keep living and so we could still have ours. And, he said, it doesn't matter that he was small, and you should not look at people and assume that they are one way when actually inside they're another. And so this story that they told to the children were actually to help them understand that we are more than we look, and that don't ever judge anybody by the way how their face is, or how big or tall they are, or how large they are, or how skinny or how small. It doesn't matter, because inside of everyone, we all have the capacity to do something wonderful and great, but we don't get that chance if people don't give us that chance. And so it was that the story was taught to children to be respectful of everybody, including the elders, everybody, because it's so important, because you just don't know what people can give. Well, Nanabazoo did not want this to happen again. And so he thought about it and wondered how he could stop it. And he saw a big turtle. He was swimming away in front of him in the water, and he got an idea. So he took the earth, he rolled it up into a big ball and set it right on the turtle's back. The turtle has a very good shell, so it was a little heavy, but he could manage it. And so he just kept swimming along. And Nanabazoo said, you know what, we're going to be okay if there's another flood, because now the world is being held up on the turtle's back. And so the Ojibwa actually traditionally believed that the world was being held up on the turtle's back, and that we would never have to go through a flood again because of that, because if it flooded, we would just float along. So the turtle being important, you'll find that on a lot of clothing, a lot of moccasins and drums. My drum case has a turtle on it. So it's a very, very important creature in our culture, and not just in the Ojibwa culture, but in other people's cultures as well. One of the other things that we loved was music. And music was an important part of anybody's life, whether you're Scottish or German or whoever. But it was very important to the native life too. And children were taught songs at a very young age and taught how to drum and how to sing those songs. And so we had things like naming ceremonies, and we used a lot of instruments in that. We burned sweetgrass and sage. Sweetgrass is basically a long grass that is bundled up. And if you burn one end of it for a few minutes and then blow it out, it will continue to smoke. It smells really sweet. Again, sweet grass. So sage has an earthier smell. It's a smaller bundle, and it was used for different ceremonies. But the naming ceremony was for children after they had been around for a while. They did not name their children right away as soon as they were here. They waited to see until they developed a personality, and then they were named accordingly. Interestingly enough, you can actually grow out of your name, basically. Excuse me. Like if you were Little Bear, for example, and you grew up to be 6'10", 300 pounds, you probably didn't look so little anymore. And you could actually ask an elder to rename you and give you a different name, and then you would get a different, have a different ceremony and get a different name. Okay, so one of the last things I would like to do is talk to you a little bit about Thanksgiving. We just had it. Everyone hopefully had a safe Thanksgiving. So Thanksgiving, what I remember as a child is seeing a picture of the Pilgrims sitting around a table with the Native Americans or the American Indians. They were laughing and passing food, and I thought that was really interesting and a really nice picture. It wasn't until I grew up and really started looking into my culture a lot more in depth that I realized that's not actually how it was. And really, if you think about it, it makes sense because first of all, the first Thanksgiving, what we consider the first Thanksgiving, was actually the very first harvest that the Pilgrims were able to have because they actually came to this country with a lot of seeds from their own country that weren't going to work in the soil that we have here. And so their gardens were not as plentiful as they could have been had they grown different things. And so it was the part of the Native Americans that helped them learn what grew here and what things you could eat out of the woods and things like that. And so that first harvest was a really big deal because they had finally grown enough to probably get them through a winter. And that first winter was terrible. And so they didn't want to lose any more people due to starvation and being sick and things like that. And so it was a really great celebration. And they were, while they were still wary of the Native Americans, they wanted to thank them in some way. And so they had a Thanksgiving, that what we consider a Thanksgiving. And that actually took more than one day. It was several days of dinners. So the natives would come with some food that they would contribute, and then they would eat and visit the best they could. Then they would leave, go back to their village, come back the next day. So if you can imagine having Thanksgiving at your house 3 or 4 days in a row and having to cook all that food, it was probably quite a big deal. But the other thing I wanted to tell you about was that they didn't sit at the table with the Pilgrims because if you think about it, they didn't even know what a table was. They actually sat on the ground when they ate. And so what the real picture should be is the Pilgrims sitting around that nice long table on a bench, and then the Native Americans or American Indians surrounding them a couple of feet away, eating. So it would have looked a little bit different than what we're used to seeing. And so I always find as I'm digging through and educating myself even more and more about my culture, that there are little things like that I grew up thinking was one way and was not. Actually, it was a different way. The one thing I want to leave you with is I'm going to sing one more song, and we consider it the gratitude song. And it basically or loosely translates into, I am grateful for this good life. And the reason I want to sing it to you is not because I have a great voice today, but because hopefully you will remember going through all this COVID that we have, all these problems from COVID, all the closings and the e-learning in schools, and, you know, being worried to even step outside your door. I think it's important during this time of year, especially because we've been living with COVID for a long time now, several months, is that we have to remember what the good things are in our life and be grateful that we have those good things. Be grateful you have a home because there's some guy down the street that sleeps outside at night because he doesn't have one. You know, be grateful that you have food on the table. Be grateful for your family and friends when there are people that are alone and don't have that. And so what I'm trying to say with my song is just to think about, instead of thinking about all the things that are bad and that are going on in the world like that, to try to remember all the things that are good. So I'm going to sing for you one more song. And like I said, it's called the Gratitude Song. Bibi which windam ma baba marizi wen. Bibi which windam ma baba Well, thank you very much. I would be happy to take questions if anybody has any.
Thank you so much, Kim. That was lovely.
Oh, thanks. My gravelly voice. I don't know what the heck.
It's that time of year. There's allergies
I
and
know.
colds. And
Yeah, I have allergies and asthma, and I think it's just
with the weather changing.
rearing its ugly head. Yeah.
Most definitely. Well, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat or in the Q&A. We'd be happy to ask and answer them. This is a great way to round up National Native American Month. Those of you that didn't know that every November is National Native American Month
Yeah.
in the US. All right, we've got a couple of questions. What
Okay.
type of oil do you recommend to treat your drum head?
You know, I have never used oil on my drum head. Somebody else asked me that too. When I got this, I asked somebody to make this drum for me. And when I asked them about how to care for it, they said not to worry about it. So I don't know if they treated it with something ahead of time, but I've never had to put oil on the actual drums. So I don't know. I wish I did. Maybe there is some sort of oil. I don't know what it is. And I've never had the actual drum heads crack. I've had the sinew crack, but again, it dries out. It's, that's actual real deer ligament, so it dries out.
Excellent, thank you. What does the word Ojibwa mean?
And actually, what they believe it means is puckered up, which is weird. But if you take a look at a moccasin that's an Ojibwa moccasin, the way they sew it, it's actually puckered up around the toe. And like if you get the Minnetonka moccasins, they're sewn really nice all the way around. It's not like that at all. There's a weird pucker around the front. And so that's what they actually think that Ojibwa means.
Oh, interesting. That's fascinating. Our next question is, how do the American Indians track their genealogy? Is it through oral histories?
Very difficultly. So, I get that question every presentation. I wish I had a magic answer. It's very hard. There are Indian enrollments that they did, but they don't go back far enough to actually know, like you hit a dead end. I actually got back as far as my grandfather, and then when he was little, but they just didn't keep track of that. And so, I mean, they weren't important, so it's very, very difficult. If you know anything, for example, maybe okay, they lived at the White Earth Reservation, call them because they might be able to help you. They have records and maybe they can go back farther. If you have any idea, well, I think they were Ho-Chunk, which is actually the same as Winnebago Indian. And they lived in Wisconsin, I think. You can start with the Ho-Chunk tribe and see if you can get some help looking some things up, because they do have probably a little bit more than what you'd find online. Like a lot of people, I belong to ancestry.com because I was really trying to search back into that and try to see how far I could go. But the last thing I was able to find was my grandfather's name as a child on an Indian roll, basically. So I wish I had better news, but that is like I said, it's hard to find information that just isn't there anymore. That's what the problem ends up being.
Yeah. Thank you. Our next is a combo comment question.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Kim. Your talk was so interesting. Once COVID is over, where's the best place to find out where the powwows are?
Well, if you live in Illinois, I would check to the Quad Cities has a powwow that goes on every year. The Mitchell Museum, which is a wonderful Native American or American Indian museum that has lots and lots of representations of tribes and things. They also they're in the know of where things are. I think Prophetstown has something that goes on every year too, someone told me. So you really have to dig, to be honest. Now, if you live in Wisconsin, you wait till the tourism guide comes out, because Wisconsin has a Native American tourism guide, and in that guide tells you where all the powwows are and what time, when they tell you everything. You could spend all summer and fall going to powwows, because they have so many that they actually have their own guide. But I know I did talk to somebody in the tourism business about the Native American doing something with that. And there's just not enough activity going on right now, especially now. But there hadn't been. There was maybe 2 or 3 powwows in the state going on during the summer or during the season. So I don't think it's enough to put a whole guide out. But yeah, otherwise the tourism department would know too, because usually people will go that direction trying to publicize it.
The Mitchell Museum, I believe, is in Evanston. And then locally, if you're in Schaumburg, we have the Trickster Art Gallery, which might have information as well.
Yep.
Oh, this is a fun comment, not a question, but a comment. I was given an Indian name when I worked at an Arizona prison. I helped the Native American inmates to build a sweat lodge. To thank me, they gave me a name. Mine is, and I apologize if I mispronounce this, Matawakan, which means Thunder Bear.
Wow, that's really neat. That's quite an honor for them to give you a name. Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Another comment, they are doing a lot with DNA to get American Indians in touch with each other. And then we've got a couple more questions. Do you use the term First Nations?
First Nation is generally used for the not native, let's say the Indians that live across the border into Canada. If you go to Canada and say, I'm a Native American, they go, you mean First Nation? Are you First Nation? We went to Canada for a trip long before COVID hit. And I got off, we took a cruise, and I got off the boat and onto the pier and into the city. And someone asked me, they said, are you Indian? And I said, yeah, I'm Native American. And they go, oh my gosh, I have never met anyone Native American. I only know people who are First Nation. And I thought to myself, we're all the same people. I don't know what you're talking about, but it was just funny. But yeah, most of the time, First Nation is used for Canada.
Interesting. Thank you. This program was captivating. Another comment. Doesn't each tribe have their own religion?
I don't know if I'd use religion as the word to describe it. Most tribes have their own way of praying and ritualistic ceremonial things to God or the creator, Gitche Manitou in Ojibwa. So I know there's a religion called the Native American, religion, but initially it wasn't that formed. You know what I mean? Every tribe and every nation has their own way of being spiritual and praising God, I guess. And so, like I said, they have different ways of doing it, but I don't know that it's considered a religion, at least not way back then. Yeah.
Yeah, we had a comment come in, beliefs and culture might be a way to refer to it.
Yes. Yep.
And then another question, if Mother Earth takes care of all of the living, then what is the Father in charge of?
The Father as in who? Like the father of the family or the father? What? I'm not sure what you're asking me. I'm sorry.
Could clarify that question a little bit. I'll go ahead and wait for that to get typed.
Okay. Anishinaabe, by the way, means first people. And it is used, the Ojibwa consider themselves the first people. So do the Dakota Sioux. So do the Cheyenne. So does the Sauk and the Fox. Whoever you talk to who's native will tell you that they were the first people. collectively, we were the first people here. Yes. So yes, Anishinaabe, that's what that means, first people.
Thank you for answering that one.
Yeah.
We've got a clarification.
Okay.
Father in reference to Mother Earth. So maybe if there's like a counterpart to Mother Earth.
There's not a counterpart to Mother Earth. There's just Mother Earth. So yeah, so I mean, there were actual spiritual and cultural things that were done to honor that too. You know, the Native Americans thought, pretty much always thought that we're just stewards of this earth, that Mother Earth and God, they own this land and we're just taking care of it. We don't own it, which is why it was such a huge problem when they were signing treaties and why they were being moved off their land, because they couldn't figure out how you could sell your land to somebody when you didn't own it. Mm-hmm. It's like going next door and going, I'm going to sell your land off, so we're stewards of the land. And so we work for Mother Earth. We work to keep her going and to keep her beautiful, and sacred.
Can you tell us a little bit about the white buffalo?
I know there's a lot of spiritual beliefs about the white buffalo. I don't personally, I know I've heard of the white buffalo, but I don't know a whole lot about it. So I can't really expand on that just because I don't know a whole lot about it. But I know it's very sacred and very spiritual, and you don't kill, you wouldn't kill that. But yeah, I don't know.
Right, I think that might be it for questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Kim. We really appreciate having you here, and we hope to have you back again soon. Oh, I think we may have gotten one more comment. Thanks for everything. This has been amazing.
Oh, well, thank you so much for coming. I just wanted to say one last thing, and that is whatever you decide to do for Christmas and New Year's, please be safe and well throughout that. I will be praying for all of you that you remain healthy. So hopefully into next year, and hopefully so we can get some kind of vaccination and get us out of this terrible mess that some of us are experiencing. So
definitely. And gratitude. We do have, we're announcing our one book, One Community tomorrow, and gratitude and perseverance is one of the themes of that book. So keep your eyes peeled for that, folks. All right. Well, thank you so much, Kim, and have a good day.
Thank you. Everybody. Yep. Thank you for coming, and thank you for asking me.
Definitely. Take care.